When talking about pop culture, one way Japan specifically has portrayed theirs is through anime. Starting to gain traction in Japan around the 1950s and has since spread throughout the world as a popular form of media. The connection between popular culture in Japan and anime is relevant because anime represents a sort of cultural consciousness that can be portrayed on screen. The anime I think that fits the saga of Tana the Evil, an anime that has lots of Western influences, notably one with German influences. The anime isn't alone either. A lot of anime in Japan seem to give off German vibes, or not specifically German, then just Western. So why exactly? Well, first let's talk about history. World War I. Japan joins the Allies against Germany. Once a decisive opportunity against German forces was seen, Japan joined the war and secured the Western Pacific and the Indian Ocean for the Allies. After Allied victory, Japan got a seat at the Treaty of Versailles in France. Japan thought its voice would be considered. Unfortunately, this was not the case. Japan's proposal for the equal respect of nations through the Racial Equality Act was rejected by Australia, the British Empire, and the United States. This was to the Japanese a sign of disrespect and left the Treaty of Versailles early in outrage. Japan at the time, with increasing population, wanted to expand, conquering territories in Manchuria and establishing colonies there. The League of Nations deplored this action and censored Japan's invasion. Japan saw this declaration from the League of Nations as hypocrisy and racial discrimination, seeing how readily Europe conquered and divided China in the southeastern sea. Germany, however, unlike the rest of the European neighbors, did not look down on Japan, but rather was impressed with their victories in the Western Pacific. German troops were recorded as acknowledging Japanese troops instead of ignoring them, like the French and British did. This held a lasting impact on the respect of the Japanese people towards the German military, which is still manifested in German military cosplay to this day. I'm not trying to say that the Axis alliance in World War II was created because of these interactions, but they did serve as a good introductory diplomacy. Germany's acknowledgement of Japan's equally to itself fueled an increasing Japanese favor for imperial expansion. Japan wanted Western approval, and Germany's acceptance of this immortalized this in Japan's consciousness. This consciousness sometimes manifests its historical bias or outright censorship. Japanese students do not learn about the war crimes of Germany during the war, only the impacts and conclusions of the war in terms of Japan. This often surfaces when an unassuming Japanese cosplayer buys and wears an SS officer uniform and is reprimanded online both by more conscientious Japanese and foreign nationals. Examples of this German core type of media and anime are nearly everywhere in eras of anime since the beginning of the 1950s. Fate Stay Night, Girl Under Panzer, Heltia, Hellsing, Dies Iri, Attack on Titan, and JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, to name a few. Not to say these are anime are German Western centric, rather heavily influenced by it. However, Germany isn't the only Western power that affected Japan. Another more negative example would be the United States. Japan and the US have a mixed history because, for the most part of their early interaction, Japan has always been humiliated and forced into treaties or trade agreements that they did not want to. Despite this, though, the US was one of the catalysts for the Meiji dynasty and its subsequent restoration of Japan to occur. The forceful opening of Matthew Perry was just the boost Japan needed for rapid industrialization and westernization. China also influenced Japan's rise, not wanting to copy their defeat against the British in the Opium Wars. So a question arises, why does Japan not have its animosity against the US when their history together is filled with rivalry that accumulated in the nuclear bombing of 2 Japanese civilian centers? There are longer answers, but the shorter answer is the US helped Japan rebuild after the war into a global economic and cultural superpower. The rewriting of Japanese constitution also made the nation democratic and dissolved its military, which allowed for the government to increase spending on infrastructure, agriculture, production, and entertainment. This effectively made Japanese products increasing in quality for the nation to become a cultural powerhouse in the East. Arguably, this is the reason as to why modern Japanese have such a positive impression of Western powers. Of course, this is not universal, but if popular media is to be observed, the Japanese see Westerners as mostly passionate, moral, altruistic individuals, with their only detriment being little socially inept of the etiquette of Japanese culture. This is why you see a lot of blonde female characters inside a very dark-haired Japan, how the dyeing of hair inside certain social circles is accepted, and why music like rock and roll, punk, and garage band have become popular. Of course, this has also increased corporate greed and a very extingent work life as a nation caught up and extended its conquerors. Indicative of this, if we bring back to the anime in question, the very first scene is a company bureaucrat laying off a normal worker for not meeting standards. It is well known how stressful work life is in Japan, and this is translated into anime with hardened or several salarymen. But anime is used to escape the day-to-day realities, so this trope is rarely shown. Atheism, or a form of non-conformist spirituality, is growing in the nation due to foreign influence. Japan has always had many faiths, but none of them were strictly adhered to. This is why weddings are held at Christian church festivals, at Shinto shrines, and burials at Buddhist temples. Atheism is growing in Japan because of a wave of philosophy that is imported from the West, namely pragmatism and utilitarianism that has replaced the old moral codes of Buddhism and Shinto. Although the majority of Japanese claim that they are still adherents of Shinto or Buddhism, the Japanese partake in the more ideology of do not bother others. Tanya the Saga of Evil is a perfect accumulation of these points, from the jarringly westernized modern Japan in the beginning scenes, the representation of loss and faith, the need for escapism in anime through Isaki genre, and the fantastical violence of the pseudo-historical Germany at war. Though brief, this anime highlights all the influences of the West in Japan. Tanya, the Saga of Evil, isn't the first anime represent the connection between Japan and Westernization, and it won't be the last. There are anime prior to these depicted in trends like Koji's. As the country expands as a global cultural superpower, it will also continue to make media about the West and its impact on pragmaticality, progressive, and socially conservative Japan.